Hey guys, here's the first introductory lesson for HOSA Behavioral Health. We'll discuss some of our favorite parts of the curriculum and hopefully get you guys interested as well. Primarily, we'll be talking about the event structure, some early perspectives, the split brain test, Sigmund Freud, and Milgram's experiment. Behavioral health is an exam event. There will be 100 multiple choice questions, one tiebreaker essay at the end, and 90 minutes for the total exam. Most of the important concepts will be taught at the start, which includes the mind, disorders and treatments, prevention, identification, recovery, management, wellness, stress, coping, and two topics worth 5% only, laws and regulations, and health systems at the end of the curriculum. A simple question to start: how would you define the mind? Or in other words, what is the mind itself? The question is actually quite philosophical, but as many people tried to study the mind objectively, it soon became a science of its own. The field became very intricate, and then psychology was born. And psychologists have been trying to answer that question for many years and centuries. First, we have the structuralists, founded by Wilhelm Wundt, who created the first experimental psychology lab in 1879, and this was truly attributed as the source of psychology as a science separated from philosophy. For structuralists, if they were to study a computer, they'd be taking it apart and tinkering with all of the small things inside to see how it worked. Except instead of a computer, they'd analyze that for the brain. Meanwhile, there are functionalists. Functionalism was founded by William James, who disagreed primarily with structuralists. Functionalism was actually a response to structuralism, and what they do is they look at the brain by tinkering with it, by analyzing it when it is under change in certain scenarios, much as someone would study a computer by tinkering with it, by messing around with the keyboard and mouse. And all psychologists, regardless of their perspectives, are looking at the phenomena of the mind. That includes, but is not limited to, personality, memory, sleep and consciousness, and the brain and the nervous system. Now, we'll be talking about the split brain experiment. Basic explanation of the split brain concept is that the brain has a left and a right cerebral hemisphere. Some brain functions, like speaking and motor control, are localized to primarily one side. The hemispheres are connected by cerebral commissures, and one of the main cerebral commissures is the corpus callosum. However, some people with life-threatening epilepsy can develop seizures if their corpus callosum is not severed. Hence, there are split brain operations that are done to treat these life-threatening epileptic seizures. Now that the corpus callosum is severed and the brain looks more like this, the hemispheres can no longer communicate with each other. In a normal patient going on with everyday life, no changes are actually observable, but when you put them under a lab with close observation, you start to notice some very interesting things that will happen. Here's the role of the visual field in people with split brains. The information from the right visual field goes into the left hemisphere, and the information from the left visual field goes into the right hemisphere. Now, this is applicable to all humans, but under very specific circumstances, they can be used to target split brain patients. Now, the left hemisphere is responsible for speech. So, if the patient sees DiCaprio in the right visual field, which goes to the left hemisphere, the left hemisphere is also responsible for speech, and they are able to name the actor and call out Leonardo DiCaprio. However, if I show them the image in their left visual field, that goes into the right hemisphere, which is not responsible for speech. Then they are unable to vocally identify the actor, and they won't be able to identify any image or text shown in the left hemisphere with their voice. Now here's when it gets interesting. What if I show them two images, one in the left and one in the right visual field? The right hemisphere is also responsible for motor control. The patient says that they see Hermione Granger because that goes to their left hemisphere. But then, if they close their eyes, they'll draw out Harry Potter because that's what the left visual field has and hence goes to the right hemisphere. They'll only be able to draw that with their left hand because the left hand is controlled by the right hemisphere and vice versa. Now notice that these answers are incompatible, and split-brain patients don't have faulty memories. They'll simply find explanations to justify this discrepancy. They'll say things like, oh, I always associate Harry Potter with Hermione Granger, which is why my two displays and my two answers are inconsistent. The two hemispheres acting as different entities shows that essentially this is two separate souls in one body. Next, we'll talk about Sigmund Freud, who was one of the later psychologists. His psychoanalysis theory was a development from hypnosis, which was one of the perspectives, which was one of the techniques used by his colleagues. When he played around with this technique, he was not satisfied with its results and hence developed psychoanalysis. One of the main factors of psychoanalysis was free association, which is to encourage the patient to speak freely about whatever comes to their mind. While psychoanalysis itself is mainly rejected from the scientific field by now, it was the first form of talking therapy which is still used today in many other forms of therapy. The main tenets of psychoanalysis are the following. Number one, the unconscious mind is the source of all issues. Number two, repressed traumatic memories manifest as symptoms in the present. Number three, humans are inherently selfish and aggressive. And this has a lot to do with the id and the superego, which we'll talk about on the next slide. When a psychoanalytic therapist takes a look at a patient, they're looking for two things primarily, transference and resistance. Transference is literally the transferring of feelings from someone else onto the therapist. For example, if the patient rages out at the therapist or expresses closeness to the therapist, thanking them for all the help that they've done, or blame the therapist for their incorrect techniques, a therapist would be very interested in things like that, and would think that the patient would react similarly to other people in past experiences. Resistance is the concept of having unconscious wishes to maintain fantasies and avoid punishment. Now, efforts to uncover this material will be resisted by the patient, and that's the concept of resistance. It can take many forms. The therapist will be very interested if you start being skeptical of their interpretations or denying you, or they're suddenly changing subjects in the middle of their free association, because that means that they were in the middle of saying something and they suddenly realize, oh, I don't want to say this out loud. What could that possibly mean? To a psychoanalytic therapist, that would imply that you are getting closer to the hidden truth that your subconscious has repressed. Yeah. Here is the human psyche according to Sigmund Freud. It contains the id, the ego, and the superego. The id is filled and motivated only by instincts and pleasure. If you've ever seen that famous TED Talk about procrastination, the id is the equivalent of the self-gratification monkey. The superego, on the other hand, would be the justified thinker with extreme discipline and only does what is right. Its restrictions are supplied by society. For example, the superego would hate to procrastinate and only does work and does everything that they consider to be right. In the center, we have the ego. The id and the superego are always in conflict, so the ego finds many ways to balance it out. Its main motivator is delayed gratification and needs to resolve that conflict within the self. Finally, we'll talk about the Milgram experiment, which is the origin of the famous slogan, "We do what we're told." Now, the original experiment and the published paper is called "Obedience to Authority: An Experimental View." The experiments started in 1961 at Yale University, where Stanley Milgram taught at. It tried to answer the question of, under certain extreme authority, would personal ethics outrule the authority? Now, it turns out that the answer is no, and in most circumstances, the authority always wins. Now, this is quite ironic because this experiment itself arguably breaks some ethical regulations that would not allow this experiment to occur today. Here is the general concept. There are three roles: the teacher, the learner, and the experimenter, who is Stanley Milgram. The teacher pairs words and then administers electric shocks to punish learners if they don't remember those paired words. Meanwhile, the learners try to match the word to word pairs. If they're wrong, they are administered shocks. And the experimenter, who is Stanley Milgram, is dressed in a lab coat, and if the teacher is uncomfortable with administering higher and higher voltages, the experimenter will force the teacher to continue going on. Now, these shocks were from 15 to 450 volt with 15-volt increments. So essentially, the teacher would list out word pairs, for example, apple, banana, pear, juice, grape, fruit, cat, dog. After that, they would call out one word, for example, cat. If the learner, instead of saying dog, says something like grape, then they will first be administered an electric shock. If they are correct, then the teacher will simply move on to the next word pair. Once they get the second one wrong, they will be administered a shock of 30 volts all the way to 450 volts if the teacher does not stop. But here's the catch. The teacher is the only subject of the experiment, and learners were always confederates acting out the pain. The pain was not real. While Stanley Milgram advertised the experiment for participants, he advertised it as a scientific study of memory and learning. When the participants arrived in the lab, they put slips of paper and took them out to determine who would be the teacher and who would be the learner, when in reality, both slips had the teacher role in it. It was just that the confederate would always tell the other person, the participant, that they pulled out the actor role, that they got the learning role, rather. Now, the results of the experiment were both quantitative and qualitative. All of the participants experienced sweating, trembling, stuttering, and they even dug their fingernails into their skin at points. There were a lot of extreme anxiety responses, and 14 out of 40 of the original participants showed nervous laughter or nervous smiling. There was a very high obedience rate. In the original study, where all the ethical confounds were not concerned with because there were no ethical regulations at the time, all participants went above 300 volts. and 26 of the 40 original participants went to the final voltage of 450 hertz volts. So that begs the question, are all humans necessarily so evil, or is it just because we are under the influence of being obedient? Because now you'd think that we wouldn't be so susceptible to the influence of the boss, who is the experimenter and the researcher, pressuring us to keep administering these electric shocks. However, even after the ethical regulations had been put in place, Stanley Milgram repeated the experiment, and future researchers even also replicated the experiment. They even measured how proximity to the actor, who was the learner, would influence whether or not they'd go to the highest voltage. And while it did decrease a bit, most people still went above very high thresholds. Alright, so that's about it for the content in today's lesson. If you have any questions, please leave them down below in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next lesson.